Greetings, friends and fellow warriors, in the strong name of Jesus. My name is Hank Voss. I am the director of Taylor University's Sacred Roots Thriving in Ministry project. If you are wondering where you are, uh, which is a vital worldview question, I could mention that you are directly over the center of the earth. I could also explain that you are in a workshop that is supposed to be taking place in 2020 for the 72nd annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society. Specifically, I am recording in Muncie, Indiana, from my COVID bunkhouse in the corner of my garage. I'd like to dedicate today's session to two men. The first is Reverend Hector Cedillo, who you see in front of you on the podium. Hector was my first church plant team leader in Los Angeles. We spent years worth of Friday nights at Denny's doing men's Bible studies together. He's the one who taught me the saying, a leader is a reader and a reader is a leader. Pastor Hector never had the chance to complete a high school diploma, but in honor of the 20th anniversary of the Church by the Lake in MacArthur Park, Los Angeles, I think you see Hector preaching here at the 10th anniversary celebration. I want to dedicate this proposal to Hector because he is one of the congregational leaders I have in mind that the Sacred Roots Project is designed to serve. Secondly, I want to dedicate this presentation to Sharif. And I mentioned Sharif specifically as a way to connect to our conference's annual theme. As you all know, the theme for 2020 ETS is Christianity and Islam. Sharif is identified for us by David Garrison, who in his very important book, Church Plant Movements, identifies 25 emerging church plant CPMs, church plant movements, one of whom is Sharif. And Sharif, between 1991 and 2001, launched a church planting movement amongst Muslims that resulted in 4,000 churches and more than 150,000 Muslims coming to faith in Jesus Christ. Now, mind you, this is in the context of severe persecution with martyrs and miracles, as one would expect. The Sacred Roots Project really is designed to serve leaders like Pastor Hector and like Sharif. So again, my name is Hank Voss. I am, and the picture on the left of the Urban Ministry Institute, this is the last class I taught in Los Angeles. I'm the white guy right in the middle. I taught at TUMI, the Urban Ministry Institute, from 2001 to 2017. And I now, since 2017, have been teaching at Taylor University. The picture on the left, which is my last class at TUMI before I moved to Taylor, shows you that the median age of my students there was around 45. That class had students with over 100 years of incarceration experience. If you look at the students on the right, who I now teach at Taylor, students like Grace, like Isaiah, and like Lucas, you see that they are typically of a different, younger generation, but have the same amount of kingdom potential that you would meet in my classrooms in South Central Los Angeles. If you do have comments about this presentation, my email address is at the top there, and you are welcome to contact me at any time. So I want to say welcome to you who are watching this presentation, and I really have no idea who you are, but I suspect at least that those of you who are part of the Sacred Roots Project and part of ETS will be watching. So I want to say welcome to Dr. Kerman Imes, editor of Volume 1, the first Sacred Roots Spiritual Classics. I want to say welcome to Dr. Greg Peters, editor of the second Sacred Roots Spiritual Classic, and also a senior editor with our Sacred Roots project. Welcome to Reverend Andrew Dr. Draper, Spiritual Classics editor for Volume 4 of the Sacred Roots series. Welcome to Dr. Bob Lay, who is also presenting in this little colloquium. Dr. Lay is the editor of Volume 5 of the Sacred Roots Spiritual Classics. Welcome to Reverend Dr. Robert Romero, who is the editor of Sacred Roots Spiritual Classics number 8. Welcome to Reverend Dr. Jeremy Treat, who is the Sacred Roots Spiritual Classics editor for Volume 7. Welcome to Dr. Uche Anazor, who is a Sacred Roots senior editor. Welcome to Dr. May Young, who is a Sacred Roots Sacred Roots senior editor. Welcome to Dr. Robert Vasquez, Reverend Bernard Emerson, Reverend Bob Engel, and Dr. Jason Sexton, who all play important roles with Sacred Roots and have been a part of the ETS community at varying levels through the present. Sacred Roots really represents a team of teams, if you're familiar with the language that retired General Stanley McChrystal uses. Over 90 teams are involved with the Sacred Roots project, and if it's a project that is of interest to you, there's plenty of room on those teams for you to get involved as a member of ETS. The place I'd like to start thinking about the Sacred Roots project, the research, the question that this workshop is supposed to be about is this quote from Dr. Don Davis. Reverend Dr. Davis, multiple times in conversations, has said something along these lines. The cries of the urban poor today represent the greatest missionary challenge the church has ever faced. Yes, the cries of the urban poor represent the greatest missionary challenge the church or the world has ever faced. And Dr. Davis is the author of over 500 books, pamphlets, and study resources for congregational leaders serving among the poor. If you received the Christian Scholars Review, I featured him in an article in the summer 2020 issue as an exemplar of theological education for those who are serious about engaging in public theology, especially for those of us in North America. The Sacred Roots project that you're hearing about today is a footnote. In other words, the Sacred Roots Thriving in Ministry project, which is what we're talking about in this workshop, is a footnote to a much larger project that Dr. Davis is leading called the Sacred Roots Project. And so if you see the kind of Sacred Roots logo that is in the corner of this photo, that Sacred Roots is actually the logo for the larger project, and we have permission to use it as our logo in the Sacred Roots Thriving in Ministry project that we're hosting here at Taylor University. Since we're evangelicals, I know we love scripture, and so the rest of this presentation could be looked at as midrash on a single text, Matthew 9:38. In Matthew 9:38, Jesus says, look at the harvest, it is ripe. Ask the Lord of the harvest to raise up workers for the harvest fields. And I don't know how you obey that command of Jesus, but every day my cell phone alarm goes off at 9:38 in the morning to remind me to pray and ask the Lord to raise up workers for the harvest fields and to make me one of them. And so a habit I would invite you to consider is daily, whether it's at 10:2 in honor of Luke 10:2 or 9:38, set your cell phone and ask the Lord for workers for the harvest fields. The hashtag Matthew 9:38, hashtag pray the workers prayer daily are really at the heart of what this workshop is about. The hashtag resurrect evangelical third orders is just a joke to make my friend Uche roll his eyes. So you can ask me about that if you need more explanation or context. So really there are 5 objectives for today's workshop. First, we want participants to be able to explain the context of the Sacred Roots project. Secondly, we want participants to be able to recognize the names of key people related to the Sacred Roots research project. Third, we want participants to feel excited about the opportunity to be involved with the Sacred Roots project. Fourth, we want participants to commit to engage with the Sacred Roots project. And 5, we want participants to consider a habit of praying daily for workers for the harvest fields. So hopefully you'll see us make progress on each of these 5 objectives. You may be interested to note that those 5 objectives relate to the concepts of habitat, head, heart, hand, and habits. And every spiritual classic in the Sacred Roots series includes discussion questions at the end of each chapter related to those 5 concepts: habitat, head, heart, hand, and habits. And so So the objectives for today are connected to the objectives one finds in Sacred Roots Spiritual Classics. Pierce Brown in 2009 wrote a novel called Red Rising. So in my grandfather's generation, authors like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien told stories and wrote songs that shaped my grandfather's generation of the good, the true, and the beautiful. My high school son loves reading the Red Rising stories, where the protagonist is a guy named Darrow. Darrow is a freedom fighter guided by a particular vision of the good. The vision is embodied in a forbidden song, a song sung by his wife Io before she is executed by their people's oppressors. And Io is executed because she sings the forbidden song. But for the rest of the novel and then on into the sequels, Darrow, who becomes this radical freedom fighter, his vision of the good is guided. His vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful is guided by Io's song. And he goes through trials and tribulations and eventually even personal transformation as he moves towards the telos that is promised in Io's song. In our world where 2 billion people live in poverty, the question I have for you today is, who will write the freedom songs for the Bartholomew de las Casases, for the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, for the Sharifs and the Hectors of this generation? That's the question we're wrestling with in the Sacred Roots Project. Before we get to the content specifically of what we're working on in the Sacred Roots Project, I want to say a few words about the global and the local context that has set the project in motion. To begin with, in the global context, there is over 3 billion people living in unreached people groups today. This is part of what Dr. Davis means when he says the greatest missionary challenge in the history of the church faces the church of this generation. Never before have there been so many people alive at one time who need to hear the good news about Jesus Christ. So it's a missionary challenge in word. It's also, however, a missionary challenge in deed. Today in the world, there are over 2 billion women, men, boys, and girls who live in abject poverty. 1.3 billion of them live in urban slums. And when you look at where the world will be in 2050, you see that that number will increase from 33% of the world's population to 42%. So really, today in 2020, my generation's job is to equip the next generation's job to be able to effectively reach and serve the 4 billion people who will be living in poverty by the time I reach the age of 70. That's part of how I view my task on earth. And I think really the task of those of us in the Evangelical Theological Society, how will we respond to this great challenge indeed for people to know in word and deed that the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think this is the central question for those of us in the Evangelical Theological Society. That's a bit about the global context of this project. The specific context is that in 2018, Taylor received a $990,000 grant from the Lilly Endowment to fund the Sacred Roots Thriving in Ministry initiative. In 2019, some 60 conversations and consultations were held across the United States and internationally in preparation for the launching of the project in 2020. The project is now bringing together over 100 evangelical theological educators from more than 30 colleges, universities, and seminaries in order to provide resources and training opportunities for some 800 evangelical congregational leaders serving among the urban and rural poor, among the incarcerated, and in new church plants serving in challenging ministry contexts. These leaders receive a number of resources, including the Sacred Roots Spiritual Classics. The Sacred Roots Thriving in Ministry project is currently in the process of identifying, editing, and publishing these 16 spiritual classics in service to congregational leaders who are working among the poor. So that's both the general and the specific context of the Sacred Roots project. To give a concrete case study, we're looking at serving leaders like the Reverend Hector Cedillo, preaching here in Los Angeles. If you live in Los Angeles, you know that And these numbers may be somewhat dated by now, but in 2014, there were around 18 million people living in the greater Los Angeles area. And according to the US Census, about 4 million of those were living below the poverty line. So the Sacred Roots Project is especially concerned with serving leaders like Hector who live beneath the poverty line in communities like South LA. Moving from the global and local context of the project, let's talk specifically about what the project is trying to do. And this is the abstract that I submitted to the ETS team. In this paper, we're going to explore the Sacred Roots Project has explored more than 50 Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox collections of spiritual classics and identified some 1,400 texts used for the cure of souls during the past 2,000 years. Many of these texts have been used across multiple centuries and across diverse cultures. This paper identifies the spiritual classics used by John Wesley, Phoebe Palmer, Elizabeth Fry, and A.W. Tozer, that actually should be Howard Thurman, as historical examples of past Protestant ressourcements. And then explores how spiritual classics can be used to equip contemporary congregational leaders in subject areas like biblical studies, theology and ethics, Christian ministry, and global mission. In order to accomplish the objectives we've laid out for us in this workshop, we need to define what we mean by a spiritual classic. The photo to the left is a quote that is inscribed in the library, the Zondervan Library at Taylor University. The quote says, "All books are divisible into two classes, the books of the hour and the books of all time." When we talk about spiritual classics, we're talking about books that are of service to believers really in all time. At least they've proven helpful to Christian leaders serving in many different cultures across many different centuries. The Sacred Roots Project has found a lot of help from Steve Porter's definition in reading the Christian Spiritual Classics, a guide for evangelicals. And if you're interested in the Sacred Roots Project, I'd strongly encourage you to pick up that volume, which you can get from Kyle Strobel, and read through those essays. Our student research teams all read that book as part of preparation to engage with the Sacred Roots Project. As Sacred Roots, though, we are operating with a simpler definition. A Christian spiritual classic is a non-canonical text attested to across generations and cultures as helpful for the cure of souls. As a general rule, we are only considering books that are 50 years or older, and that's the simpler definition we use when we're looking at Christian spiritual classics. You may have a question as to how are we identifying and selecting the spiritual classics that we use in the Sacred Roots Project. So we've explored 50 Protestant, mainline and evangelical, Roman Catholic and Orthodox collections of spiritual classics. And from these, we have identified some 1,400 texts that have been used for the cure of souls across the past 2 millennia. Now, we have a ranking system where, depending upon the number of lists that a particular spiritual classic appears on, it receives a higher ranking. So if you can think about those 50 lists, they're laid out in an Excel spreadsheet. A text like Augustine's Confessions appears on around 30 of those 50 lists. And so Augustine's Confessions would get a ranking of about 30 out of a possible 50. Imitation of Christ is on about 22 or so of those lists, and so it receives a ranking of 22. And by comparing these lists, we're able to identify some, or give each of the 1,400 spiritual classic texts a quantitative ranking. Now, there's also other variables that go into ranking the spiritual classics. So, for example, Michael Casey, in his book Sacred Reading, The Ancient Art of Lectio Divina, identifies the spiritual classics that are part of the Roman Catholic breviary. And so you can see texts that appear and are read by Roman Catholics globally, texts like Alred, Ambrose, Athanasius, Augustine, roughly 30 texts that are read in that collection. A collection that has Catholic of Catholic interest receives some extra points in our ranking system as we find ways to quantitatively and qualitatively identify which spiritual classics might be of the most help to congregational leaders serving amongst the global poor. It's important to be able to identify the historical precedents that go before and inspire the Sacred Roots Project, the Sacred Roots Thriving in Ministry Project. I want to just briefly name four, which I don't have time to go into today. But hope many of you may be familiar with John Wesley's Christian Leaders Library, a collection of 50 volumes. It included over 100 Puritan spiritual classics, as well as spiritual classics from Pietists and the Great Tradition. This library was something that Wesley intended every class leader, both lay and ordained leaders in the Methodist societies, to read. So in other words, congregational leaders in the Methodist churches were encouraged to read these. It eventually became a collection of 30 volumes of spiritual classics as a key to formation and as a key to preparation for being a worker in the harvest field. So Wesley's Christian Leaders Library is an inspiration and historical precedent to the Sacred Roots Project. Elizabeth Fry is the only woman besides Queen Victoria until recently to appear on a piece of British currency. She placed libraries of Christian spiritual classics in every prison in England as part of her effort to reform prisons across the United Kingdom. Elizabeth Fry, this well-known evangelist and minister of the gospel, is a historical mentor for us in the Sacred Roots Project. Phoebe Palmer, I have argued, actually I follow people like Tom Oden and others who have argued that Phoebe Palmer is the most influential Protestant theologian in the global church. In our book on evangelical theology, shameless plug, it's coming out in 2021, next April. We talk about Palmer and her influence on the global evangelical church. Anyways, Palmer mentored a number of women and men. So Bishop William Taylor was one of her mentees, who was a missionary to Africa, to Asia, to South America, as well as the first missionaries from the United States to China. Those Chinese missionaries brought with them a spiritual classic that was very precious to Phoebe Palmer, the spiritual classic on prayer by Madame Guyon. I'm not sure, my French is not that great. Anyways, Madame Guyon's spiritual classic on prayer became extremely influential to the Chinese church. And what for me is the most interesting journal article of 2020, Glenn Scorgie's presidential address. It's printed in the journal Spiritus. Scorgie traces how that spiritual classic became profoundly influential on Watchman Nee, and through Watchman Nee on over 100 million Chinese believers today. And so historically, it's of interest to us in the Sacred Roots Project, watching how a spiritual classic from the 1800s was used as a resource by a theologian like Watchman Nee to shape the theological imagination of a movement of evangelical leaders in the Chinese churches across China today. Phoebe is an inspiration for us in the Sacred Roots Project. A fourth leader I want to mention as a mentor and a historical precedent for the Sacred Roots Project is Howard Thurman. Reverend Dr. Thurman's grandma was a slave, and his maternal grandma was who heavily influenced him growing up as a young boy in Florida. Thurman went on to become a research expert in the spirituals of African Americans, and he considered these spirituals to be spiritual classics and a gift to the church as a whole. You may know that Howard Thurman was a mentor, the spiritual advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King. And when you look at Dr. King, you can see how the spirituals, these slave songs, were used to inspire a movement of leaders in North America and move the civil rights movement forward. An example of how spiritual classics can be used to shape the imaginations of God's people as they participate in the proclamation of the gospel in word and deed. These are some of the historical precedents that we look to in the Sacred Roots Project. So we've talked a little bit about what spiritual classics are. We've talked about how spiritual classics are selected, and I want to finish by just a few notes on how to use spiritual classics. And the Sacred Roots Projects, we're trying to help congregational leaders think how they can use spiritual classics in subject areas like biblical studies, theology and ethics, Christian ministry, and global mission. We're a year behind because of COVID, but the first 4 volumes, one in biblical studies, one in theology and ethics, one in Christian ministry, one in global mission, will come out in April of 2021. You can see that the biblical studies volume is Praying the Psalms with Augustine and Friends. The theology and ethics volume is Becoming a Community of Disciples, looking at Benedict and Basil. The Christian ministry volume is on spiritual friendship, looking at Alred's spiritual classic named Spiritual Friendship. And then the global mission is an anthology of the best writings on Christian mission and the poor, edited by Dr. Andrew Draper. We have tentatively scheduled out the remainder volumes in the Sacred Roots Spiritual Classics, although the only ones that we're committed to are Volume 6, Volume 7, and Volume 8. Volume 8 is being edited by Robert Romero, a member of this conversation we're having at ETS, and then also Volume 6 is by Dr. Bob Lay, a member of the conversation in our ETS, and I hope you can join us at the question and answer time for our conversation with Bob, Robert, myself, Greg, Peters, and then others who will be there as well. So the key that we're trying to use with these spiritual classics is really hinted at by Dr. James Houston. Dr. Houston is a model and mentor for all of us on the Sacred Roots team. You see here Dr. Houston with Greg Peters and Uche Anazor, who are senior editors with our Sacred Roots project. Houston described using Julian of Norwic's spiritual classic Revelations as a powerful key for those who have been sexually abused as children. Often those who have been sexually abused as children have a difficulty understanding or accepting God's love for them. And Dr. Houston has described how in his work with victims and survivors of sexual abuse, the spiritual classic showings or revelations has been a powerful tool to help members of congregations who are dealing with sexual abuse. These are the kinds of issues that we're working with the Sacred Roots, is helping congregational leaders think through how a volume like Augustine's prayers on the Psalms could be used today, perhaps to help congregational leaders or congregational members learn how to pray the Psalms in the year 2020. Or a book like Benedict's rule or Basil's a rule for discipleship communities could help discipleship forming communities in 2020 learn wisdom on how to be faithful and fruitful in our context today. These are some of the perennial pastoral problems that we think spiritual classics can help Sacred Roots leaders address. Hey, if you're interested in continuing the conversation, here's a couple ways you can do so. First, the paper behind this presentation will hopefully appear in the Journal of Spiritual Formation and Soul Care, or some similar related journal. Secondly, there's a white paper from the Sacred Roots Project that's available that lists the 45 sources, the list, the collections, the anthologies from which we have collected our longer list of 1,400 spiritual classics. And then the first 4 Sacred Roots spiritual classics will be available on Amazon by early summer 2021. These are all ways you can connect with the project. You can also scan this QR code, which will take you to a short survey where you can leave your email. You can also let us know what your favorite spiritual classic is and help further the research that we're engaged in here at Sacred Roots. Other ways, you could pray for the project. You can like us on Facebook. You could sign up for our newsletter. You can email me directly, or you could talk to somebody already involved and learn more about the project. Again, thanks for your time, and remember, pray for workers.